way, I mean, given all the centenary noise at the minute,
Mhm.
where we're kind of working through the War of Independence, and then we're going to start with the Civil War. I know in the work we do around Century Island, there's also the sense that suddenly you're going to get to 1923, 2023, and everybody's going to say, that's it, pack up the tent, the decade's over.
Sure.
In a way, is that the kind of gap that Cummin na Gael fell into historiographically, that it wasn't a revolution?
Mm.
State building is kind of boring, it has to be
Yeah.
done, but it's boring. And all the interesting stuff started when Dev got on board. Is that what's...
Yeah, I think that's a really fair assessment. Cummin na Gael is not the most exciting party to write about, or state building is not sexy history in comparison to the revolution. It's essential everyday necessities for building a state, but there's nothing particularly exciting about it. And somebody like W.T. Cosgrave, though an important figure in terms of building the state, he's not a charismatic character. It doesn't divide loyalties in the same way that De Valera did, perhaps. And I think, there's an element as a result that the Cummin na Gael, the 20s in general, have been or had been overlooked. I mean, that's changing now, obviously. But there is also, I suppose, that tendency when you get to the birth of the state to then perhaps skip forward and think about the creation of the Republic in 1948 as well, which of course then means that the Cummin na Gael era gets missed out, or even maybe to go to the 1937 Constitution. But there's, in terms of kind of the landmark moments, although the 20s are really important, there is nothing that's seen as quite a signature moment in the history of the state as there is in 22 or 37 or 48.
And just, I mean, obviously, you think about Verita's book on Dev that was kind of, famously Mary Hannafin demanded that every school get a copy.
Mhm.
And you had that Fianna Fáil kind of building of its own history of Dev as being central at it. It's the problem in a way with Cosgrave is not simply that the work that had to be done wasn't dramatic and romantic. It wasn't shooting at soldiers and fighting civil wars. It was building the state. It was civil service heavy. I mean, does he pale into insignificance and Cummin na Gael disappear in a way because Cosgrave does come across as very dry, he does come across as very boring. And once they lose that election in 1932, he's kind of done. That he just doesn't have that, although a seminally important political figure that you could think about, as you say, nation state builders in the 20s who have huge kind of mausoleums built in their memory. Cosgrave just gone.
Yeah, I think that's quite fair. It's one of the reasons why when Fine Gael is being created that the party is so willing to embrace Eoin O'Duffy as well, because he's seen as having the promise of being another Collins figure. I mean, it doesn't pan out that way, but he seems to have all that promise of charisma. And actually, once O'Duffy is stage managed out of the party and Cosgrave returns to the helm, there's all these really interesting correspondence between members of the party, quite high profile people, lamenting Cosgrave's return to the leadership, saying things like, any chance we have of beating Fianna Fáil is gone now. So Cosgrave, he once the 32 election is over and Cummin na Gael have gone to the opposition benches, he's sort of a spent force by that stage. I mean, there's still people who have loyalty to him, but in terms of seeing him as the future leader or further leader of the party who can offset the advances of Fianna Fáil, he's not seen as someone who has that ability.
And obviously, once you've done the Cosgrave book, obviously this year is the big book on Fine Gael, which for a historian does that kind of quite unusual thing that goes up to almost yesterday, that you take in the 21st century, you take in the Varadkar into the title. What was the motivation for doing that? Was it just simply continuing the story? But in a way, why pitch the story so far to now?
Yeah. I've always wanted to write a history of Fine Gael ever since the PhD was finished. This was something that I had wanted to do. I don't have the time to do it on my own. So that was part of the reason why Stephen Collins became involved with it as my co-author. And of course, with Stephen being a journalist, he comes from a different place than me. And so it seemed appropriate with him on board that we do take it up to the present day. But also, I think one of the reasons why we did was once Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael entered coalition, or at least even before that officially happened and the rumours were happening, there were so many people taking this kind of long look back at both parties' history and the evolution of the political system, and trying to make sense of how both parties had arrived at where they were and had reached a point where they could seemingly bury their old animosity and join together in a coalition. And I suppose that was one of the motivations for going right up to the Varadkar era, to think about how the party had come so far from, you know, being one of the political children of the Civil War to now being in government with the other political child of the Civil War, effectively. So yeah, it was about taking that really long view and thinking about how the party has got to where it is today, what the lines of continuity are, but also how it's changed over time as well.
But as a historian, the terrifying thing must be when somebody says to you, somewhere around the late 1980s, there's no more archives.
Yeah,
you're on your own. That you are kind of mixing that kind of strange sense of this, like the Cosgrave book, this really deep archival project, with then the end of it, which is it's material, but it doesn't have that same stamp. I mean, did you find that difficult, or was, I mean, I got no sense reading it. I can figure out loosely which bits you did, but I mean, it's seamlessly written. Is there a point in the production of the book where you just kind of said, Stephen, that's yours, that's the modern stuff, that's the journalist stuff?
You know, it's funny, everybody assumes that I wrote the first half and Stephen wrote the second half. We co-wrote nearly all of the chapters together, and in some cases, some paragraphs even are co-written. You know, that was the extent to which we worked together on it. I did struggle with the later stuff, I will be honest, because, as you say, it's not in my, you know, in my comfort zone to work without archives and so on. But I suppose we benefited from having access to some people's privately held papers. And we also made a lot of use of oral history as well, or interviews, I suppose, as the journalists call them instead. So there were elements, I suppose, of what historians would work with, but just taken much, you know, up to the contemporary. It was a challenge, though, writing it at times, and writing with a journalist as well. My very first draft that I sent Stephen, he rang me then and we had this conversation where he said to me, I think you need to reconsider, you know, your tone a little bit in it, because I had all the usual academic trappings of this chapter will make this argument and it will draw on and so on and so on. And because the book is obviously written for more of a general audience as opposed to, you know, a specifically academic one, that wasn't going to make it particularly readable for the wider audience. So yeah, both the absence of archives from the 80s onwards and changing my style, I think they were both things that I struggled with at certain points during the process.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but just to remind everybody, if you have got questions for Ciara as we go along, type them in, and then Joel, keep an eye on that, and we'll come back to those later. So just that experience, Ciara, as you say, I mean, all the training we all have is to do very kind of turgid academic things with all that lovely framework that keeps us safe of footnotes and qualifications and sophistications. To have somebody who then is driven by a completely different way of writing, probably by a publisher as well who's expecting a completely different kind of book. Was that the stuff of nightmares? Was it a blossoming that will allow you to see your life different in the future? I mean, how traumatic was it?
Do you know, it wasn't that traumatic at all, actually. Initially, when Stephen and I talked about doing this, I was active on Twitter at the time, and I had tweeted asking for people for their advice about co-writing. And I would say 99.9% of people who responded came back with, don't do it. And I think even within academic, communities, co-writing can often be a fairly traumatic experience. Once we got past the initial me writing like an academic and Stephen writing like a journalist, we sort of met almost in the middle, and we both edited each other's work as well to try and get it, our voices into each other's work. It made the process much smoother, and after that initial kind of teething stage, I can honestly say it went quite smoothly then with us. There were times where I would suggest to Stephen that, because of my awareness of the archives, that there were certain things that he might want to draw in. And then again, because he's such a veteran political commentator, there are events that he remembers covering and was able to give other angles to me because of that. So rather than our different disciplines being a drawback, I actually think they were quite useful in terms of us both rethinking, I suppose, certain things. I'd also say that I feel like my writing style has evolved a lot as a result of this book. And obviously with academic writings, there are certain what's the word I'm looking for, certain forms that need to be followed, that this article will, and so on, but at times I don't know, in the past I've maybe got a bit bogged down in dense writing, if that makes sense. And I think writing this book has perhaps challenged me to be a little more accessible, perhaps, in how I articulate my thoughts.
So would you do it all again? Are you and Stephen going to write another book, or?
I'm currently lined up for another project, so it'd be a long one, it'd be down the road. But I would very happily work with Stephen again. Yeah.
The first president leader of Fine Gael was not on the cover. He was tucked away on the spine. So Oliver's question is, why do you think Fine Gael as a party seemed to deny its blue shirt antecedents, or at least not to accept them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would correct you there, Mike, because I know he is on the spine, but I wouldn't say he's tucked away on it.
Okay, fair enough. Depends how you arrange your books.
Well, that's the thing. So
he's probably the most visible.
It is. He is the most visible, because that's how most people will see it on the bookshelves. But I take the point, though. I mean, no matter where we placed O'Duffy, I think, it was going to raise certain issues. But to go back to the question about why do Fine Gael kind of deny that element of their history, O'Duffy is such a controversial character. And Mike, you will know this even better than I do because of your work, his relationship with the blue shirts, and his own expression of fascist thought at times, a lot of the time, doesn't sit comfortably with a party that, as their title hints at, because, well, not hints at, is quite clear about, and it comes from the party's own self-labeling. It's a party that is about building the state, about defending the state, and about defending democracy. And O'Duffy's perceived threat through fascism to those claims, doesn't sit comfortably with the party. And if we think of today how the slur of blue shirt rather is still used to criticize members and to basically slag off people who support the party or politicians within it, you can see how they are so quick to dismiss or just not talk about O'Duffy at all. And what I find really interesting is they don't even go back to W.T. Cosgrave, they go back to Michael Collins instead, which again is why we framed the book Collins to Varadkar, even though Collins, of course, was dead before Cumann na Gael was ever founded.
I was going to ask you, because that was the other great sort of thing I saw constantly on Twitter, and is mentioned in some of the reviews, that you went back in the title of the book from Collins to Varadkar. You went back to a man who, for all his prominence in Irish history, was never a member of the party because the party didn't exist before he was killed. I mean, I've read the book, but I mean, just to kind of illustrate to people who are listening, why did you make that decision?
Yeah.
I appreciate it's probably good marketing to have his name there, but I know in the book there's a kind of intellectual reason.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, first of all, you are right. There is a marketing reason behind that, but also from the intellectual perspective, we wouldn't have put Collins on the cover were there not, we thought, at least a justification for it, and that is that Fine Gael sees him as a father figure for the party. He occupies a very special position in the party's pantheon of heroes. And as Anne Dolan, has written, from the party's perspective, he died before he did enough to damn himself. And so he doesn't have the same kind of controversy that surrounds W.T. Cosgrave in terms of, the challenges he faced in building the state. And he definitely doesn't have the tarnish of Ono Duffy and the blue shirts and the fascist movement. So for Fine Gael, it suits them to go back to this romantic revolutionary figure. And our book is as much about looking at the party's own self-perceptions and their own interpretation of their history as it is looking at its actual factual history. And at various points, there isn't a chapter about Collins in the book, but he does appear at various points. And that's when people like Enda Kenny, for example, during the whole financial crisis, positioned himself in the context of Michael Collins. And, he talked about having to save the state again in the way that Collins had saved Ireland, and brought about independence. And I think it's really fascinating the way that the party have used him. Even when Michael Noonan conceded after the 2002 election and he was being interviewed on RTE News, right behind his shoulder was this bust of Michael Collins. He is an ever-present figure in the party, despite, as you say, being dead long before Fine Gael was ever created. So yeah, we don't make any claims that he was a member of the party or indeed a leader, but that's something that the party themselves, I suppose, have tried to present, perhaps.
I think